dog ate half of a corn cob. Now, it wasn't my fault. I wasn't there. It was my wife. Okay, my wife did it. She was overseeing that. Had nothing to do with it. But, hi honey, I love you. Anyway, but, I had to take him to the emergency room to like the, vet ER thing. So middle of the night, it's like 9 p.m. It's still kind of like COVID procedures in certain places. So I can't walk in with him. I have this dog in the back of my car, and everything we had read was like, this could be deadly. So like, you really want to, get sure that they see him. I call, say, I'm here, and they say, we're going to send a nurse in a little bit. The nurse comes out like in an hour. Was that me? No? Okay. Let's hope it wasn't me. Anyway, no, they say they're going to send a nurse. The nurse comes an hour later. She checks on him, and she's like, we're going to come back, and we're going to, look at him and tell you, what's going on. They don't come to get the dog until like midnight. I'm there for like 3 hours. Now, when you're sitting there thinking that your dog is going to die, 3 hours feel like 10. And I remember this feeling of being in the waiting room of my car, worried about my dog and not knowing what's going to happen. And my guess is that everybody in this room has had an experience like that, right? Maybe it was on the ER. Maybe you had something going on and you go there and they're packed and they basically tell you, unless you have a limb that's about to fall off, you're going to have to wait and you're there for 5 hours. Or you had this terrible toothache and you go to a dentist and you show up early before the appointment and you still have to wait for 45 minutes. If you've ever had to have any interaction with the DMV, you know what it's like to sit in a room waiting for hours. And the laugh that you made is because we hate waiting. It's never pleasant. And we're never usually waiting for a good thing. We're usually waiting for something that it's either tedious and we want to get done or something that we would rather not be doing and we have to wait. Now, the thing is that this is a reality not only of like, waiting rooms and emergency rooms. This is kind of like a fundamental factor of life. If you think about it, most of the things in life are things that we wait for, right? Think about the big milestones: getting married, graduating high school, graduating college, getting that dream job, getting the promotion, whatever it is, are things that don't happen from one day to the next, or things that we wait for. This is also true with the difficult, unpleasant things of life, right? You have to wait for the test results. Cancer treatment takes time, and we have to wait to see how it goes. Divorce proceedings are things that take time, and we have to wait. Addiction recovery is a journey that takes years. Most of our lives are spent in the in-between waiting periods of the big milestones events. The problem is that a lot of us, we kind of live looking forward to that thing. And what that ends up doing is that we sort of like skate through life. And a lot of times we're never fully present in the moment because we're always looking to the next thing. I have a friend that, is an incredibly smart, brilliant person, and he had like 5 jobs in 2 years because he cannot sit still. He gets bored of a job and he wants the next job, and he's already like thinking about the next thing. And a lot of us live lives like that. And the problem is that if most of our lives is spent in the waiting room, in the in-between, if we don't learn to wait well, we end up missing out on a lot of the important things of life. We end up missing out sometimes on the things that God wants to do in those in-between waiting periods. Now, what does any of this have to do with Christmas? Well, because Christmas, when you think about it, is really a story of learning to wait and the result of the things that come when we wait. When Mary receives the announcement that she is going to become pregnant with Jesus, well, that happens in the context of a promise that the people of Israel had been looking for hundreds of years, that one day God was going to send this Messiah. And because of this, historically, for the church at large, this kind of like season leading up to Christmas is actually seen as a season of slowing down and a season of waiting and preparing ourselves for the coming of Jesus. This season is meant at its best to center us on Jesus and make us yearn for the hope of his coming. We call this season Advent. And Advent is really about waiting. We put ourselves in the shoes, or actually the sandals, of the people of Israel who are waiting for the promised Messiah that's coming at Christmas. So that when Christmas happens, our hearts are full of expectancy and we can appreciate the events of Christmas more deeply. But as Christians, we also can use this season as a time to remember that we ourselves are waiting, right? That we're waiting for the return of Jesus Christ to put all things right. And most of us are also waiting to see God move in our lives in the here and now in some way or another. So if there is a theme to this series that we're starting today, is learning how to wait well, which is why we're calling it Waiting Room. And what I do is I'm going to go back and we're going to take you through a few stories of people in the Bible who are waiting for something. And what you realize that these stories are somehow also connected to the story of the people of Israel waiting for the Messiah. And what we want to just see is, are there any lessons we can learn in these stories about what it looks like to wait well? And more importantly, what it looks like to wait on God. And this morning, I want to take you all the way back to the beginning of the scriptures. We're going to go all the way back to the book of Genesis. And I want to read you a story that starts on Genesis chapter 12. I'm going to start reading on verse 1. The Lord had said to Abram, "Leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you." If you're familiar a little bit with the story of Israel, this is the story of Abraham. At this point in the story, his name is not Abraham yet. His name is Abram. And at this moment, Abram, we think he's about maybe like 75 years old. His father has just died. And as far as we know, fascinating is like he's never really heard of the Lord, like God, Yahweh, the Lord of the Bible before. He has this encounter out of nowhere, hears his voice, and this voice just tells him, "I want you to go out and I'm going to give you great descendants." And what's incredible about the story is that Abram believes in this voice, not knowing really who it was, and decides to obey and steps out in faith. And he gets this promise that his descendants are going to become this great nation, and that somehow, through that one act of faith and obedience, God was going to bless all the families on earth. And I see this as an incredible act of faith on a number of reasons, right? A, because Abram probably has never heard of Yahweh before. And also because he doesn't know where he's going. But there's another reason that why I think this is fascinating. It's because of something that we haven't seen yet, but happens in the chapter before. So I'm going to take you back to chapter 11, and I'm going to just read you a couple of verses starting on verse 27. This is the account of Terah's family. Terah was the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran was the father of Lot. But Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans, the land of his birth, while his father Terah was still living. Meanwhile, Abram and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. Milcah and her sister Iscah were daughters of Nahor's brother Haran, but Sarai was unable to become pregnant and had no children. Abram and Sarai have no children. And it sounds that at this point, they don't think that they just don't have any children yet, that they think they're never going to have any children. So when you think about it and think about Abram listening to this voice, telling him, "I want you to step out in faith, and I want you to go somewhere that I'm not telling you yet where you're going. And also, by the way, I'm going to give you these incredible descendants." I don't know how Abram is processing that, because either Abram is delusional, or Abram believes that somehow this voice that he's hearing has the power to do impossible things. Many, many years later, the writer of the book of Hebrews is reflecting on this story, and he says this: "It was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and go to another land that God would give him as his inheritance. He went without knowing where he was going." The writer of Hebrews is saying the reason why Abraham takes a step of faith is not because he's delusional. It's not because he's lying to himself. It's because he's believing in the promises of this God and decides to act on it. Now, most of us are familiar with the story of Abraham. Eventually, his name becomes Abraham, and he and his wife Sarah have a child called Isaac, and the nation of Israel kind of like descends from that. But in between this moment where Abraham receives this promise from God and the moment where Isaac is born, there's about 25 years of life. And it's like, for matters of time, I had to cut out most of this, but I tried to summarize it real quick. They get into all sorts of adventures. They live like nomads for a while. Eventually, they end up in the land of Canaan, where God is telling him that he's going to give him that land. There's a famine in the land, so they have to kind of like move away to Egypt. They have, Abraham has a nephew called Lot that he loves like a son, and Lot gets captured in the middle of this war. Abraham has to go like Liam Neeson in Taken and like gets like a band of guys together and goes rescue him. During the travels that Abraham and Sarah have, whenever they went to like a new land, apparently Sarah is this incredibly beautiful woman. And Abraham was worried that whenever they went to a new town, that the king of that area was going to kill Abraham for his wife Sarah. So what he did is like, they're going to take you anyway. So why don't we just lie and say that you're just my sister and we're not married? They can take you, but I get to live, which sounds like a stand-up, courageous, brave guy, right? That's who you want to start a nation with. And, and it happens twice. And every time God has to get involved and God kind of like pronounces judgment on the whole situation. And, Abraham and Sarah have to like leave and escape and keep on moving. In the middle of that, also, God keeps appearing to Abraham and keeps repeating the promise and telling him that one day he's going to have descendants that are going to become a great nation. But Abraham and Sarah keep getting older and older and older and older, and there's no children. And you'll start noticing that at some point they start kind of like, sort of like deciding to help out God or take matters into their own hands. So first, Abraham wants to name kind of like his head butler as his heir, which was practice common at the time when you didn't have a male heir. And God shows up and says, no, I'm going to give you a son. Then they're saying, well, God's promising Abraham a son, not Sarah, so maybe that's a problem. So Sarah basically makes Abraham take her servant Hagar, and be with her and have a child with her. That ends up in disaster. Like, that creates all sorts of jealousy. Abraham and Sarah are horrible to Hagar, absolutely horrible. The Bible kind of like judges and indicts them for how they treat her. And, when you read the biblical story, that act of disobedience and distrust leads to this day, conflict and pain and strife and suffering. And yet, in the middle of all that, God keeps showing up and God keeps appearing to them and God keeps promising Abraham that he is going to fulfill his promise. When Abraham is 99 years old, God appears to him again and he does two things. One is that he changes his name. He changes Abraham's name to Abraham and Sarah's name to Sarah, and the names have meaning. It's kind of like Father of Nations, and Sarah becomes kind of like a princess. It's like this important change of names. But then he also gives him a timeline. He says, a year from now, you're going to have a child. And we finally get to Genesis chapter 21. The Lord kept his word and did for Sarah exactly what he had promised. She became pregnant and she gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. This happened at just the time God had said it would. And Abraham named their son Isaac. 8 days after Isaac was born, Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. And Sarah declared, God has brought me laughter. All who hear about this will laugh with me. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse a baby? Yet I have given Abraham a son in his old age. I love that line at the beginning of this chapter. The Lord kept his word and did for Sarah exactly what he had promised. So what do we make of this story and what lessons can we learn from it? And I would say there's a couple of things that I want to highlight here. The first one is this, that we spend the majority of our lives in the waiting room. and how we spend our time there matters. Think about Abraham and Sarah. Yeah, we covered this whole story. You kind of like walk through all of that. That's like a bulk of their lives. Like 25 years is not nothing, right? And like what Abraham is famous for is having this kid, right? And in between the moment that he gets his promise and the moment that that promise is fulfilled, he goes through a lot of life. And two things happen. One is, he makes a lot of mistakes. Right? He tries to take matters into his own hand, and he disobeys God, and he lies, and he disappoints. And Abraham and Sarah together, like they mistreat Hagar horribly and do bad things. And at the same time, in that in-between period, somehow they are able to maintain the faith that God was going to fulfill and keep his promises. And that hope, that faith in the promises of God is the things that keeps them kind of like tethered to God through all of that time. And I say that because I think that that's also true of all of us, if not most of us, right? That we spend so much of our time waiting for the next thing. We're, in high school, cannot wait to graduate high school. Then we're in college and cannot wait to graduate college. And then we graduate college and we cannot wait to either, start the new job or get our master's degree. And a lot of the conversations at that age is about getting that thing and then getting to the next thing. And the danger is that a lot of times what happens is that we kind of like go through the time that we're in sort of like coasting. And we're not fully focused on it. And a lot of times what happens is that either we become blind or deaf to the thing that God wants to do and God wants to teach us in the moment. Or also, if we're honest, we end up making mistakes that have deep and profound consequences in how we live the rest of our lives. Another thing that happens is that sometimes we're waiting for God to do a thing, and when that thing doesn't happen, and doesn't happen in the timeline that we want, our hearts grow bitter and sometimes even cold towards God. Another thing that happens is that sometimes, we're waiting for the thing, and when the thing is not happening, we decide to take matters into our hand, just like Abraham and Sarah do with Hagar, or when tried to do with Abraham's butler. So we make compromises. And those compromises only lead to pain and suffering. We lie to get ahead because we think that we ought to get that promotion, right? We give into practices that we know are wrong. We get into the wrong relationship with the wrong person that we knew was the wrong person. But we were tired of being alone, so we didn't care anymore, only to have that relationship end up in pain. But I think that the reverse is also true. That the time in the waiting room can be a time of preparation. A time where character is molded. One of the fascinating things in the middle of the story of Abraham is that at one point, God gives Abraham this promise again, and there's something in the line, when you read it in the Hebrew, that says that he believed God. And years later, the book of Hebrews says that God took that statement that Abraham believed in God as proof of his faith, and he says, and he counted it to him as righteousness. That somehow molded in the midst of the waiting for God and of the seeing God move and do things in his life, even if that promise of a child hadn't come yet, Abraham's faith in God was forged. What if the time in the waiting room is not just seeing a time that we want to skip by or move on to the next thing, but if we see it as the time where God is doing something in our lives? Maybe you feel tired of waiting to be single, but what if the time right now you're single is the time that God is shaping you to be the husband and the wife and the father and the mother that he wants you to be? And there are lessons that you're learning right now preparing you for that. That you're here waiting for that promotion and you are so frustrated, you keep being skipped over for it. And yet, this is the time that God is using to turn you into the best supervisor, the best boss, the best CEO, the best admiral, the best general, the best whatever thing, because of what he's doing in your life right now. Have you ever met people that have this unmovable faith in God? I bet you if you have conversations with them, most of them will tell you that they didn't have easy lives. That it was a faith that was forged in the waiting room. A faith that was forged in the midst of victories and defeats, of peaks and valleys of life. But they learned to wait well on the Lord, and the Lord changed them and turned them into a different kind of people through that. What if we see this moment right now that we are in whatever the waiting room of our lives is? Not as the time that we're waiting for God to do the other thing, but as the time that we're letting God do the thing that He wants to do in our lives right now. Now, in order for that to happen, there's something else that we need to do. And it's this. We have to surrender our expectations of how God is going to fulfill His promises. So much of the heartbreak and the disappointment and the frustration that happens in the waiting room is because we have a timeline and we have a plan. I'm going to graduate college by this age. I'm going to get married by this age. I'm going to have my first kid by this age. We're going to buy a house by this age. I'm going to be promoted to this by this. You know what I'm saying? Like we go out life with this plan. And then life happens, right? Is it Muhammad Ali? Like everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face? You know, we all have a plan about how life is going to turn out until we meet life. And then we realize our plans change. And a lot of times what happens is that when life changes and throws curveballs at us, we start getting anxious and weary and worried and disappointed and stressed because things are not happening in the timeline that we want it to happen. And sometimes we ascribe that to God. God, you promised me this was going to happen. You told me this was going to happen. Now this is happening. How could you? And we carry so much frustration about that. And actually, if you think about Abraham and Sarah, the biggest mistakes they make, if you think, for example, how they treat Hagar, that whole deal with Hagar and then Ishmael, that whole thing is about wanting to take God's promise into their own hands and giving God a hand and helping God out to make happen what they thought needed to happen, only to see that end up in disaster. Why? Because they had this set expectation of how things were going to happen. What would happen if we surrender our expectations for how God is going to answer our prayers? Our assumptions that things have to happen a certain way and the anxiety that comes when that doesn't pan out. What if we grounded our faith in a belief that for God, truly, all things are possible? And we learn to rest on that. How much of that pain and suffering could be avoided if we learn to maintain that faith? That He who began a good work is faithful to bring it to completion. That the same God who made promises to Abraham and Sarah and to Moses and to the people of Israel and to Mary and Joseph is the same God who has invited us to trust in Him. Which takes me to the final lesson. We have to shift the focus of our waiting from an outcome to a person. And I'll explain what I mean by this. How do we let go of our expectations? I would argue that the way in which we let go of our expectations is actually by looking to the Christmas story. Because the Christmas story is really a story of a promise fulfilled, right? It's a promise fulfilled thousands of years later. We see the first seeds of the promise of the Messiah in Genesis 3. When God tells, as He's judging the serpent and the woman, that one day a descendant of the woman is going to crush the head of the serpent. It's kind of like the beginning of the promise of the Messiah. There's like thousands of years between that and the coming of Jesus. And what that means is that all the people that somehow started latching onto that promise and believing in that promise in the in-between lived and died believing God was going to do something that did not come to pass in their time. And yet, the book of Galatians says, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth His Son. The story of Christmas is not only the story of God sending His Son to save us, it is also the ultimate proof that God keeps his promises. But here's the thing. Sometimes how God keeps those promises don't look like how we want it to look. Even when Jesus shows up, one of the reasons why Jesus is rejected so much is because the people that are anticipating Jesus at the time are anticipating something different. They're anticipating a Messiah that was more of a political figure or a military leader that was going to lead a revolution and kind of like overthrow the Roman Empire, and they get a baby in a manger, wrapped in swaddling clothes, in the midst of animals and smelly shepherds. And yet God kept his promise. And there's a tension in there. Because part of what this means is this reality that somehow some of the things that we're waiting for, that we're hoping for, might not come to pass. And that somehow God still invites us to trust him and believe in him and believe that he loves us and believe that he cares for us and believe that ultimately things are going to be all right. How is that? Let me show you this. The writer of Hebrews, thousands of years after the story of Abraham, reflects on the story and says this. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 9. And even when he reached the land God promised, and he's talking about Abraham, he lived there by faith. For he was like a foreigner living in tents, and so did Isaac and Jacob, who inherited the same promise. Abraham was confidently looking forward to a city with eternal foundations as he designed and built by God. What the writer of Hebrews is saying is that, Abraham has this promise from God that he is going to send him to this land and give him this land and give this land to his descendants and make it into a great nation. And Abraham gets to the land, and you know what happens? Famine comes to the land, so he has to leave the land, right? And somehow he's saying that his children went back to that land, and they still didn't stay in the land. And things happened, they had to move around, and you're familiar with the story of the Old Testament and everything that happens there. And then he makes his connection, he's saying, Abraham was confidently looking forward to a city with eternal foundations, a city designed and built by God. What he's saying is this. Abraham somehow, at some point in the midst of his waiting, stopped just waiting for a child and stopped just waiting for a piece of land and somehow started waiting for something higher than that, better than that, more lasting than that, more eternal than that. Because the reality is that the thing that you're waiting for, the things that we're waiting for, not all of them last forever, right? Like some of you are really being saving for that down payment for that house of your dreams, and that's awesome. As a homeowner, let me tell you, it's not always fun to own a house. And we laugh about that, but that's true of every aspect of life. Like a lot of the things that we long for, that we want, there's something underneath that we want. Some of us are struggling with disease, and we long for healing. But what we're really longing for is for disease not to exist, not to be a reality. And even if you're healed of whatever the thing that you're struggling with right now, that's not going to happen on this side of eternity. Some of us are longing for relationships to be restored, and that's great. And yet, even when a relationship is fixed, it's not perfect. And something within us says that relationships should be different, that love should be deeper. And you get what I'm trying to say, that the thing that we're longing for really is something beyond what we somehow want. And the writer of Hebrews keeps saying that. He says, verse 11, it was by faith that even Sarah was able to have a child, though she was barren and was too old. She believed that God would keep his promise. And so a whole nation came from this one man who was as good as dead. A nation with so many people that, like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, there is no way to count them. There is a connection between how we wait for the temporary human thing that we're waiting for and how we wait for God and for the eternal thing. And the writer of Hebrews kind of like brings this to a climax and says, all these people died still believing that what God had promised them. They did not receive what was promised, but they saw it all from a distance and welcomed it. They agreed that they were foreigners and nomads here on earth. Obviously, people who say such things are looking forward to a country they can call their own. If they had longed for the country they came from, they could have gone back. But they were looking for a better place, a heavenly homeland. That is why God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. What the writer of Hebrews is saying is that what you're ultimately really longing for, waiting for, goes beyond the human temporary thing that's in your heart right now. That the answer to the longings of your heart is God himself, is Jesus. That the way in which God answers our prayers ultimately is through his Son. Now, where does it leave us today? Because I say that, and it's easy for me to say that, but there's people here in this room that probably have a cancer diagnosis, and you're in your 50s, and you're terrified that you're not going to get to walk your daughter down the aisle. And there's chances that there's people in this room right now that you've been single for 20 years, and you go to bed every night alone, and you're wondering if that's just the reality of your life, and you're never going to find a spouse. And I could go on and on and on. And to be honest with you, I don't have easy answers for you. But I want to show you this. This is Psalm 27, verse 13. Yet, I am confident I will see the Lord's goodness while I am here in the land of the living. Wait patiently for the Lord. Be brave and courageous. Yes, wait patiently for the Lord. The psalmist who is always crying out to God, always waiting for God to do something, always waiting for God to somehow save and rescue and do something. The psalmist is praying and he's saying, you know what I'm sure of? That I'm going to see the goodness of God. The only thing that I have to offer you this morning is I don't know if the thing that you're waiting for, that you're longing for, is going to come to happen. But what the scriptures seem to promise is that no matter where you are in that journey, that you can experience the goodness of God. That even if the situation doesn't change, you can experience the comfort and the love and the mercy of God. Why? Because God has already given you that through his Son, Jesus Christ. That the ultimate answer to our wedding, that Christ would come and be with us, has been given to us. So you can hope, and I will take it a step further, you can demand to see the goodness of God in the land of the living. But I will say something else. Abraham and Sarah wait for 25 years to see the promises of God fulfilled, because God doesn't work on our timeline. Some of us have been waiting for something. And it's year 5, and it's year 10, it's year 15. And at some point, we just give up on waiting because we're tired. But what if it's year 24? And we don't know that a year from now, a child will be given. And we don't know that the answer to our waiting is just around the corner. And what if what God is doing is inviting us to believe again and hope again? I've never told this story in public until last service, and I asked my wife for permission before I could share this. But when we were trying to get pregnant with our son Jack, we discovered that it's really hard for us to get pregnant naturally. So we, as many couples in the world do, went through a fertility treatment. And it worked. It was great. You know, we had Jack a few months later, and it was great. And then a couple years after that, we wanted to have another child. So, started trying again, and nothing was happening. And we realized maybe we have to do another fertility treatment, and it'll be the same, and it's fine. And we went to a fertility doctor, and something changed because it wasn't working. And month after month, we would get our hopes up, and we thought that this is the month, and then we only to find out that it wasn't, and just have that heartbreak crusher. I have this memory of a Christmas Eve, going to bed, holding my wife, and we're crying ourselves to sleep because we were hoping for a Christmas miracle, only to know that it wasn't going to happen for us. And at this point, we are out of tries with our insurance, and we're out of money. And we kind of like resigned ourselves to the idea that maybe this wasn't going to happen for us. This is January. And that same January is when I started working here at the Journey. And if you were around here, the month after I started working here, we did this series called Dangerous Prayers. And, it was a series about prayer, and we did like this prayer campaign that you would get like text message to tell you to pray about something. And one of the weeks that I had to preach was a week about praying persistently. And one of the points was praying for things that we may have given up on. You can imagine how difficult it was for me to preach that message. To add insult to injury, one of the prayer prompts for that week was this, and I wrote this. Are there prayers you have given up on today? Consider bringing those prayers before God again, trusting that no matter what, He loves and cares for you. I remember where I was when I was doing my quiet time and I was praying through this. And I remember telling God, I'm not even sure I believe in this. I'm telling people to do it, so I have to do it. So God, I've given up on believing that we could have another child, but here I go. Maybe something will happen. That Friday, I had the memory, we're going to bed, I was laying in bed, and my wife comes into a room, tears in her eyes, and just looks at me and says, look what God did. And she's holding this positive pregnancy test. Julia Elizabeth turned 1 in October. And for us, obviously, she's like this miracle child, right? But you know what she's also is for us? It's a reminder that when our hopes were dead, when we had given up, when we had been done waiting, God, for whatever reason, in His mercy, reached out and told us to believe again and to wait again and revived our hopes and gave us a gift. And the reason I'm sharing this story is because what if that's true of all of us? That there's things, there are hopes, there's dreams, there's things that God wants to do through you that maybe you've given up on because they haven't happened yet. And what if God is saying, what if you believed again today? What if it's year 24? And a year from now, you're going to see the fruit of those prayers answered. And for us, it's also this reminder that ultimately God can be trusted. And she's a reminder of that, but the ultimate reminder of that is not Julia, is Jesus.